Hello everyone and welcome to MGT 415 Decentralized Finance. This is the introductory lecture in which I try to give you an idea of what this course is about and what to expect and what other things that we'll be talking about during this semester. So let's get right into it. The first question that you probably ask yourself is, what actually is decentralized finance? Now, the very simple definition, and I just wrote this here on the slides, is the provision of financial services without the necessary involvement of a traditional financial intermediary. To put it very bluntly, this means that you essentially have financial services without things like banks, broker-dealers, or an insurance corporation. Now, you may think, well, but we could have credit unions, there's other financial industry participants. The whole idea here is that you cut out the middleman, right? So we're trying to think of a way how you can have finance without middlemen, if you want. Now, why is this an interesting question? Why is this something that you should care about? Well, let me show you a little graph here. So here's a graph which shows you the total funds that have been used in decentralized finance. And one thing that I can definitely promise you is that this is an extremely hot area. Now, you may not have heard about this in the news much, but if things continue as they do now, I'm sure you will hear about it by the end of the semester. Number one. Number two is that this is really, in the general area of financial innovation, probably the most interesting, hot, and exciting area, because the whole idea here is that there are transformational changes to the financial industry are happening and are possible. Now, what you see in this graph is that sort of like the area of of DeFi has sort of been around since roughly October 2017. I explain in detail why that is the case. And you can see how the amount of money that has been put into this area is just growing exponentially, in particular in this year, and in particular actually over the last few months. There's particular reason for the growth in the last few months, and we'll come to that in detail. So, put very simply, it's growing and it's coming, meaning it's coming to markets generally. Now, as a very quick disclaimer, I should be clear that although $10 billion is clearly a lot of money that I would love to have in my pocket, on the grand scheme of things of the financial industry, it's not a lot of money. Having said that, this is mostly money from retail investors and from sort of normal people. There's really interesting questions that arise from all of that. Okay, so now, before we can understand before we talk about what DeFi is, it actually pays to think about the origins of financial institutions, right? So, because if you want to understand why this idea of getting rid of financial institutions is interesting and actually is very transformative, you should try to think about why do we have these financial institutions in the first place. So let's think about this for a little bit from a historic perspective. And when I say historic, I don't mean the 1990s, which are a long time ago for you, not for me, but for you. No, I actually mean thinking about the entire history of commercial interactions. So let's first think about money. Why do we have money? Now, in the old days, when you have a village, you could possibly trade different set of services and goods. Like a hunter could trade his hunt, his kill, or a farmer could trade his grains, or a baker could trade his bread for the hunter's kill, and so on and so forth. That is all possible, and that is certainly what happened in the old days. Sometimes that is correctly referred to as a barter system. Money is something that makes things much easier. Formally, for those of you who are trained as economists, money is a so-called numeraire good, so which is a good which denotes everything. And money is something that has the origins of money and first usages of money you find in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea is that instead of having to take the barter product around, you have something that is readily exchangeable for different items. So you can you can take a coin and exchange it for the hunter's kill. You can take a coin and exchange it for grains. You can take a coin and exchange it for bread. So that's very convenient, and what that allows people also is it allows them the ability to make transactions much faster. No? Now, what's the first money that we have? Well, the most common one was used for precious metals, such as gold. Why? Well, there's many reasons for it. It's easily exchangeable, it's portable, it's not very big and very heavy. It's also something that is chemically stable, so it doesn't deteriorate very easily. So there's many reasons why precious metals like gold were used for the longest time. Now, the next step, however, was that gold is something which is, and precious metals, there's other concerns with this, right? So what do you do with this? If you get a piece of gold, can you actually trust that it's gold, or could this be fake gold? Could this be some lead which is colored in something and you just can't detect it? Well, for that reason, people started to mint coins. So there were goldsmiths, and what they did is they took a piece of metal and they made an engraving on it to make it very pretty and to make it nicely looking. So now, why was that an advantage? Well, it was an advantage because you could then trust the goldsmith that put the particular stamp on it and that formed the coin, and that gave you some security that the person who created this piece of coin did something genuine with it and that he was not a cheat. Now, once you have done that, and once you have some money that you can trust, there's another concern, which is that you don't want to keep your gold on you. Why? Well, because it could easily be robbed, right? You could be taken from you. The old days, it was, you travel from one city to another, you leave town, you could be taken up by robbers and they take your money from you. So what was the next step? Well, institutions formed that kept your money safe. So for instance, in England, goldsmiths would do this, right? So they not only make the coins, but they also keep them for you to keep them safe for you. Now, once they do that, then it's a question of, do you have to go to the goldsmith every time you want to use money? And the answer for that is actually no. People were quite clever about doing things like writing deposit certificates, meaning that you go to this entity that keeps your coins and they write you a letter, and often a very elaborate letter with stamps and all of that, to say that you own a certain amount of money and that you therefore were entitled to use this piece of paper as proof that you had it, and you could take this piece of paper and give it to somebody in exchange for the gold coins that are held for you as a deposit. So again, what you have now is you have an intermediary, right? So the person who keeps your money safe, that also certifies that you have the money, and that allows you to make trades without actually having to physically exchange the gold in your hand or the coins that you have. Now, these safekeepers then were quite clever, because what they realized is that in addition to writing a deposit note on something that somebody owned, they could also loan money out. Why? Because not everybody who has a deposit needs it all the time. So they could basically say that this person who they wrote a loan for would be good to repay a certain amount of money in the future. And what that is essentially is that they gave people a loan, right? And that they used the money that they had in their own reserves, in their own vaults if you want, and they used it to give out loans. So all of a sudden, these intermediaries that were there just to safekeep assets, all of a sudden do something much more sophisticated, which is borrowing and lending. So you can see how the institutions have therefore developed. And now finally, of course, the world is no longer, even in the Middle Ages in particular, the world was not dominated by individual cities or by just, hamlets where people lived. But the world got big, people traded, people started to travel, right? They used wagons, horses, and so on and so forth. And with travel came trade, and with trade became the need to finance trades. So if you're a traveling salesman going from one city to another, if you earn money in one city, you want to have the ability to deposit that money in a particular bank, and then possibly go to your own hometown and then be able to withdraw that money. Why? Because, the road is dangerous and you don't want to lose your money on the trip. And so the banks facilitated this with using the deposit certificates and the exchanges that they had among one another. Now, so this is all very well, but what you can see here is that the need to safekeep assets gave rise to the financial institutions as safekeepers of money. They then expanded their role to do borrowing and lending, and that allowed commerce to thrive. Okay. Now, is that the way the world works today? Right? In today's world, let's think about it. So in the old days, when you had banks, there were essentially silos, right? The silos were given literally by physical separation. Yes, there were some banks which were operating in different cities, but still, it was just a single institution that operated and had all of their operations in a silo. Now, in the modern world, a bank is much more than that, right? A bank does not operate in a silo. What a bank does is, and I'm taking a huge leap there, and we're going to go into many details of that at a later point, but the basic idea is that every bank nowadays uses cloud computing. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that major financial institutions, instead of running their own silos of information, their own ledgers of information, what they do is they use Google, they use Microsoft, they use AWS, so Amazon, and their cloud computing services. Now, here's a map of the cloud computing data centers that Google owns. You can see they own something like 30, 40 data centers all over the world. Okay, so now you ask yourself, okay, so why does this matter? Why do we care about this? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple. If we think of the safekeeping function of a financial institution and all of this data, and what is your assets? What is your money? Well, it's really just an electronic data entry, right? So, banks don't keep banknotes, they don't keep gold. All that they do is they have electronic entries for what you own, right? And so what do they do? Well, so if all the information that you have, so if your account is just a piece of data, and if that piece of data is held by AWS, Google, and Microsoft, who needs banks? Right? Why do we need a bank? So that's the first question. It's a very big question, of course. And then the second question is, you ask yourself, well, hold on, it's still not that straightforward to transfer money back and forth. Well, you may not know this, but if you, for instance, live in a country other than Canada, or if you have family in a country other than Canada, it's actually not that straightforward to shift money back and forth. And at the very least, it's quite extensive. And if you've worked for financial institutions, you actually would know how difficult it is to move any funds around, right? So the question is, why in this world is this still difficult? And, this is obviously a fundamental question, but there's a bigger question, which is like, okay, so we have technology like cloud computing, and cloud computing is actually not the focus of this class, but I'll get to that. But we have technology that allows us to not have operations and data and value stored in silos. So is there a way how we can just get rid of these financial institutions that have these safekeeping role, right? So can we decentralize finance? Now, the questions that we there now, so this is a big question. This is try to just motivate what we're doing. But let me just give you an idea of what this course content is really about, right? So the questions that we ask is, how does this decentralization work? And as I've already alluded, we're not actually going to talk about cloud computing so much because that's not very interesting. But what we're going to do is about a technology that's called blockchain. And unless you have slept under a rock for the last few years, you will at least heard about Bitcoin. So you have a sense of what it is. Bitcoin is a major application for blockchain technology. I'm going to talk about Bitcoin extensively, but Bitcoin is not the core of decentralized finance, actually very much not so. But what we're trying to understand is how decentralization would work. So meaning you have value transfers and transactions and financial products provided without intermediaries. Now, we also need to understand how centralized works. So what roles intermediaries actually play? So how does actually bank work? And how does it fundamentally structurally work? What are the merits of it? What are the concerns about it? And then, so we want to ask is what kind of intermediation can be decentralized, and what would that actually mean to have decentralized intermediation? And not everything can be decentralized, and not anything can be disintermediated, just so we're clear about it. Having said, I think at least, but I may be proven wrong over time. Now, then we also want to understand, when you think of decentralization, is you think you have platforms where transactions and where services are being offered. And so we need to think very hard about how the economics of these platforms work. And finally, then, of course, I want you to also learn about what DeFi solutions already exist. And then, so what you can envision we'll see over the next few years, and what you can possibly contribute to yourself. Now, I want to very briefly draw a comparison of fintech and DeFi. Now, as you know, I teach another course, which is MGT 415, which is fintech. This is a course which I've taught twice before. This course, the DeFi course here, is completely new. And the reason why I've developed this DeFi course is because I realized that, well, fintech is slightly different from decentralized finance generally, and so for finance students in particular, but also for tech students and economic students, it may be interesting to actually have a much deeper dive into this particular part of the fintech space, if you want. So fintech I see as something very broad, and DeFi is something rather specific. So now, what are the fundamental differences between the two? Just very briefly. So as you can see, I have two plots here. One on the left-hand side, I talk about fintech. On the right-hand side, I talk DeFi. The first criteria where I drew this pie chart for is the innovation component relative to the salesmanship. And so in some sense, you can think about fintech is a lot about selling something. You sell something existing, but it's not necessarily particularly transformational, meaning that there's not really something which is new. It's just basically, frictions removed, transaction costs lowered, and the same thing that we had, just repackaged. DeFi, on the other hand, is quite the opposite. The salesmanship is actually very small, and the potential for dramatic transformational changes is very large. So the majority of all changes that DeFi will bring about will be changing financial industry quite dramatically. So just to give you a few examples of what fintech is really mostly about, what is a very hardcore interest there is you have user-friendly interfaces, so user interfaces, you have products that are very customer and firms that are very customer oriented, which is not necessarily what banks are actually. You have less squeezing and rent seeking. You have much more transparency from these institutions. You have more competition among services, and you have also innovative services, so things that we have not seen before. Now, what DeFi is about, and this is a description of the state as it is. It's actually not user-friendly at all. It's actually rather complicated and complex. But the premise of what DeFi firms or DeFi entrepreneurs are about is they want to kind of blow up the banks, meaning that they want to change the financial system fundamentally. It's not quite clear that they get there, but the idea is, of course, is that you get rid of intermediaries for some good reasons and some bad reasons. But we're going to get into all of that. The core thinking, therefore, is a fundamental rethinking of financial services. Now, I want to say that if you look at this space, there's lots of scam, and there's a pretty big cowboy attitude towards regulation and laws. So I want you to be aware of all of that, and I'm aware of all of that. So it's not like we're going, blue-eyed into this thing. But what we are interested in is the economic mechanisms, but also the technology and how the technology works so that the economic mechanisms can be enabled and what that actually means for markets. So this is basically the big picture overview, and I'm sure that you have a lot of questions and there's a lot of things. I used a lot of lingo that you're not familiar with. I apologize for that. All of this will become clearer in a moment.